Welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship, where we have deep, real conversations about how we can be more inclusive leaders in our workplaces and our communities. I'm Melinda Briana Epler. I'm the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst, where we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. So this is a safe space to learn, to build empathy for each other, and to understand tangible actions that we can all take to be better humans, better allies, better advocates, and make the world a better place for all of us. Today, we are here with Frieda McAlear, Senior Research Associate at Kapor Center, and we're going to be talking about designing for intersectional inclusion. Hey, Frieda, great to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here with you. Awesome. I wanted to get us started, if it's possible, in a good way. So if I can lead us out with a land acknowledgement, I'll just start in my native language. Uvla sakun nakukserunga kaimuruten. So that's my native language of Anupia. And I wanted to greet you all in a good way and start by thanking and honoring the elders and ancestors of the Lishan Ohlone people on whose territories I'm working on today. So their name for this place and their language is Huichin, and the English name is Oakland. These are forever Lishan Ohlone territories, and they're so beautiful and powerful. As part of this land acknowledgement, I also want to acknowledge that there are indigenous people of African descent who were brought here to these territories against their will, who were taken from their lands, colonized, enslaved, and detribalized, and whose families were also brutalized for hundreds of years. So as someone indigenous to the Americas, our freedom and our sovereignty are bound up together with the other indigenous people who live here now. And in order to acknowledge that interconnected liberation, I'd like to name and appreciate a woman of African descent who lives in Ohlone territories and who's fought for Black trans survival, thriving, and liberation. Janetta Johnson, Executive Director of the Transgender, Gender Variant, and Intersex Justice Project, TJIJP. Many Black trans women do not live until elderhood in our country, so it's important to honor, recognize, and celebrate those who do. So thank you for allowing me to lead off with a land acknowledgement. If it's okay, I'd like to say a few words about why we want to do one in general and get the conversation started with why I just did that. So land acknowledgements are becoming more common in the United States, and they're really to accomplish a few goals. One is to reconnect us back to our lands and to our cultural and spiritual identities, and to honor those as Indigenous people. It's also to recognize the Indigenous peoples of the land. And we really want to acknowledge in that process our role in that history, if there is one. And primarily, this land acknowledgement, and including folks of African descent, is to undo some of these lies of colonization. So colonization is a very complex and challenging issue to grapple with, but one of the ways that it shows up is not telling us who we are and what our cultures and languages and traditions are. Colonization seeks to break those relationships between Indigenous peoples and our lands, and break the relationship and internal structure of our societies. So you can find out more about whose lands you're on if you go to this website, nativeland.ca.
And for those who are listening on the podcast, we'll put that in the resources on our website at changecatalyst.co/allyship series.
Thank you. Yes, and so if you click on that, you can see a map of whose territories you're on. Let us know if you're Indigenous or tribally enrolled in the chat, and also if you have found whose lands you're on, go ahead and tell us in the chat now as well. So super quickly. Oh yeah, go ahead.
And interestingly, we did a land acknowledgement in our last episode as well. And I'm here in San Francisco, so also in Ohlone territory, specifically the Ramaytush, the Yalamu people were here. So acknowledging that we are here on their land. And respect their ancestors and their leaders, past and present and future as well.
Yes, absolutely, Melinda. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And that's an important part, is to start with the land acknowledgement, and also to understand that these acknowledgements themselves can't repair those harms of colonization.
Yeah.
So we want to create accountable institutional and personal relationships with the original people whose lands you're on as well. So where possible, you can even these days help them get their lands back. So if you're here with us from Ohlone territories, please do have a look at the chat link. It's the Sogorea Land Trust, Umi Land Tax, and consider if you would like to contribute to the rematriation efforts here on Ohlone lands. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. And I want to circle back to that. I just wanted a few logistics before we go too far into that. And as people are kind of looking up where they are and whose land they're on. So today we do have two ASL interpreters who are alternating on screen today. Thank you to Interpreter Now for our partnership. And then also we have White Coat Captioning, and Maggie from White Coat Captioning is captioning today. So if you go down to, it might be the three dots that say more, or you might just have the caption depending on what your screen looks like. So you go there and you can change the size of the captions and such as well. And then our team is also behind the scenes: Juliet, Renzo, Sally, Araya, Emily, Darlene, and among many other things. They are also in the Q&A and answering questions and sharing resources as well. And then we have a code of conduct, which I mentioned at the top of the hour, tcin.co/COC, but basically just being radically inclusive. And please do share what you're learning, share your aha moments, share what land you are on, and anything else. If you have specific things that you want to make sure that we address, please just put them in the Q&A so we can find them. Awesome. So today I want to just kind of frame this a little bit, and then I do want to talk a little bit more, address a little bit more land acknowledgements and going beyond land acknowledgements. So just today we're talking about designing for intersectional inclusion, and we're going to talk about some specific work that Frieda is doing in developing computer science programs in Native communities, and as well as the wider implications of that work. And my hope is that you all today will take from this the idea that we need to develop culturally relevant, gender relevant, intersectionally intentional programs that truly address the inequities that people have experienced and continue to experience. So we have to design differently and really think differently. And I'm hoping that by seeing this example and learning about the Frieda's work, that you will then be able to take it into your own work around allyship and advocacy. So could we, take, you kind of touched on this, but maybe we could go a little bit further. In acknowledgement is the beginning, right? Is the beginning, and under even learning before acknowledging is learning is maybe the beginning, and then acknowledging, and then there's more that we must do. Can we talk a little bit about that? What does that meaningful action really look like for you?
Thank you for that question. It's so thoughtful, and it's definitely the reason that I'm here. So I think the land acknowledgement process can begin a transformative process for people to be able to, first of all, acknowledge the histories that have happened here on these territories. And these histories, as I said, involve colonization and genocide of Native and Indigenous peoples here, but they also involve human trafficking, the bringing of other Indigenous people here. And then imperialism has created the circumstances where people are coming here for the resources that have been scooped up from all over the world for use here. So there's multiple ways that imperialism and colonization have created the vast, diverse array of Indigenous peoples here. But starting with the peoples whose land you're on, I think is one of the ways to really ground that practice of understanding, learning about, undoing the erasure of Indigenous people in our worlds. So I also, when doing this learning process, I try to encourage people to really think about their location in this work as part of their learning and understanding process. So what are your identities? And even your family history, and how do they relate to the Indigenous people whose lands you were raised on or where you live now, or the Indigenous people that have come here since? So I also encourage people who are interested in allyship to Native communities to build these accountable relationships. And I talked about that in the land acknowledgement. That's the really core practice. Colonization is meant to break relationships to land, break relationships to history and culture, break relationships to languages, to matriarchy, to matrilineal processes and governance. So we have to restore those processes. We have to restore those understandings, knowledges, languages, cultural ways of viewing the world, our cosmologies. So understanding your identities and your personal history is one part of that, but then also building those accountable relationships with that understanding so that you know exactly what's happened, where you live, where you work on those lands over hundreds of years, to the extent that's possible to reconstruct. And so you also want to approach the tribes that are now here, because they might not be the original tribes whose lands were traditionally those territories. You want to acknowledge that history with those tribes if you're trying to build these accountable relationships, and try to understand their capacity to work with allies. So not all tribes have big numbers. My tribe is 14,000. There's 574 federally recognized tribes, and then hundreds more unrecognized tribes. Right? So we're talking about a huge and vast diversity of small numbers of people. 14,000 isn't very much, but I thought that was a small number before I came to California. And I learned when I got here that 14,000 is a tremendous number for California natives who have experienced such deep genocide here. That some tribes only number, most tribes probably didn't survive, truly didn't survive. But the numbers who are here for some tribes are in the hundreds or in the numbers of families. So it's really important to understand that context and to understand what their capacity could be for working with institutions and allies who want to establish accountable relationships. So what do I mean by accountable relationship? I'll say one word about this. And accountable relationships, really, it comes from these processes of transformative and restorative justice, where accountable just means we want to maintain a relationship over time. We're committed to repairing any harm that happens in the course of that relationship to see it through. This is the type of relationship that I advocate people establish with Native folks. So building up your awareness of the history that's not taught in school, that's reconstructed. You almost have to build out your own curriculum to get a picture of what's happened here. And it can make a huge difference when you do work with Native tribes. If you know that history, you may even learn that, more from books and resources than they will have been able to have learned themselves. Oftentimes, as Native people, we have to almost buy back our own knowledge by staying in school and going to Native studies programs, paying out thousands of dollars for resources, for journal articles and books. So another way in terms of just approaching a tribe to work with them is understanding their leadership structure, understanding their sovereignty goals, their rematriation goals. How can you support those as a way to get started? How can you offer something while you're trying to establish these accountable relationships? Most of us, so upwards of 78% of Native people don't live on our own territories any longer. We've been moved off of those territories, or we've migrated to live in big cities like New York, LA, Minneapolis, Denver. That's part of, again, the structure of colonization to disconnect us from our territories. So think about the intertribal community where you live and work as well. Do they hold public events, community events that are open to the public? Sometimes these are good places to start acquainting yourself with some of the local communities. I also recommend partnerships with Native organizations and businesses. So very, very few tech recruiters and CS departments of colleges and universities are aware of this, but the American Indian Science and Engineering Society has a national network of chapters of Native people who work in and study STEM fields.
Hmm.
Always a good practice to pay people if you can, if you're working with them, for their time, their knowledge, their expertise, the networks they're connected to, if they can share that with you. It may still take some time to establish those good relationships, but the beginning is relearning history and understanding that Native American isn't actually a racial designation. It's a relationship with the federal and state governments, as well as a set of relationships to tribal lands, tribes, and the systems of life that support those lands. So you can be white, Black, Asian, and also Native. Many
Mhm.
Native people struggle with their identity in part because there are so many stereotypes about what we look like. So those are just some starting points. I'm sure other
Yeah.
folks who are Native in the chat can add to these, but these are just the tips that I've collated for audiences like this who are really wanting and hungering for these connections, but not sure where to start.
Awesome. You know what? I have one more to add to that, which is,
Yes.
as you're building your own curriculum, build that for your kids and also consider building that for your kids' schools. Because that work needs to be done, that curriculum needs to be changed, and somebody needs to do it, right? It could be you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Advocacy is a huge part of this. We need advocates and allies. We're less than 2% of the US population. So the more folks who learn about our histories and cultures, the less work we have to do to advocate for ourselves in those spaces. Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to calibrate, just to remind everybody, Native people used to be 100% of the population, right? Now only
Yeah,
2%. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. Right. And it
Um,
was tons. I mean, the genocide on this continent, I think, is something like I've heard upwards of over 90% of the original
yeah.
peoples here didn't survive to the present day. So entire peoples and languages and cultures are we won't even know their names.
Yeah. I when I was writing my book, I wanted to acknowledge some of the people who had completely cultures who had completely been wiped out by genocide, and there are very, very few records. Yeah, just yeah,
Right,
it's very, very sad.
right. We didn't have a lot of written culture. Most tribes didn't have a written language prior to contact, and colonizers definitely didn't often take the time to write much about us in the early sort of first couple hundred years. Yeah,
Mhm.
sort of an afterthought. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Could we talk a little bit about you and your story and kind of who you are and how you came to do the work that you did, and we'll kind of go into that work in a bit.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I'm going to say a few words about it, but for me, this is definitely the part that I'm least excited to talk about because um, I think, like most folks in my field, it really doesn't center on me and my identities, but I think it can be helpful context for people who are just getting to know natives in tech. So, like many native and colonized people, my background and identities are complicated, they're lengthy to explain. I can say in brief that colonization and genocide have both shaped my life in just profound and traumatizing ways. I don't want to gloss over anything, but I also don't want to center just my lone story in the work that I do. I grew up in a very complicated family. We moved around Montgomery County, Maryland, due to financial instability and precarity. So the longest I think I ever lived anywhere at one address before uh, actually last year was 4 years. My father passed away penniless when I was 18. The rest of my birth family were broke. So I left college in the first year after my first semester to start working at minimum wage jobs so that I wouldn't be a financial burden to my family. When I went back to college years later, I decided to major in CS because a mentor and one of my employers at the time, who knew about my family background, suggested it was a good way to increase my value and my employability in the job market. So I chose to study at a small American-style college in Brussels, Belgium, because
Mm.
it was so much more affordable than paying in-state tuition at the University of Maryland at the time. I think it was like half as much, even as an international student. And I experienced some of the challenges and barriers to CS in college that are common to other underrepresented people and women of color. So some factors helped me succeed in my degree program, like the fact that my father had worked in STEM before he passed. But unlike many of my white, Asian, and overwhelmingly male peers, I hadn't had access to a computer at home growing up, nor had I been able to take any CS classes in high school. My family hadn't expected me to go to college or supported me in any way, nor were they able to support me while I studied. So I had to take up jobs to support myself, sometimes during the school year, sometimes during the summer. No one in my family understood what I was studying at all. They didn't even ask. They knew it was just very complicated STEM or science. Toward the end of my degree, the dean of my CS program touched me inappropriately during an advising session. So I told some of the other students at the college and the administration, but we were told that nothing could be done because the professor had tenure. This wasn't the first time, unfortunately, that I'd been harmed by a man in STEM. So I decided to protect myself and not to enter the tech sector after graduating.
Oh, wow.
I worked at two nonprofit organizations after graduating from college. And then when I went back to university to get my master's degree, I decided to study social sciences and humanities because I wanted to be as fluent in theories of race, racism, like critical race theory and intersectionality, and gender theory as I was in technology. So
Mm.
that's what brought me to working for SMASH at the Kapor Center in 2015. And then since then, I've been fortunate enough to work on a number of projects related to race, gender, and technology, including the Women of Color and Computing Collaborative, alongside Dr. Allison Scott and Dr. Kim Scott from CJUST at Arizona State University. They're no relation, by the way, and Expanding CS for Native Girls, my latest project, co-led by Dr. Kathy Deerenwater at ACES and funded by Reboot Representation.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I think that yeah, we're all shaped by so many things, and appreciate you sharing, yeah, your experiences.
Thank you.
Um, could you then let's talk a little about your work, and then we can kind of dive in deeper into that. Tell me what you're doing now. What is the project that you're working on now?
Sure. In brief, Expanding CS for Native Girls is a project where we have built out a sequence of three culturally relevant CS courses for partner Native serving high schools. And so we wanted to make these courses both culturally relevant and gender responsive so that Native girls would be uplifted through our program. These are academic year courses. We wanted to make them rigorous. We wanted them to build in a sequence, and we wanted them to teach these girls about themselves in order to spark their interest in computer science. That's the
Yeah.
project in overview. And again, I'm just part of it. We have curriculum developers, we have culture experts, we have Dr. Kathy Deerenwater at ACES, we have Dr. Allison Scott here at the Kapor Center. Tons of folks involved at different levels, and a whole community of advisors as well to the project that I'm proud to represent today, even though I'm just one tiny part of it.
I don't know about tiny, but yes, a part of it. Yes. Okay. So, well, let's dive into what does it mean to design a culturally relevant program first, and then we'll go into gender responsive as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, culturally relevant is it's a term that was developed by Black women educators, theorists, and researchers such as Gloria Ladson Billings and Geneva Gay. And they're both still alive, by the way, amazing
Mm.
folks. The core of culturally relevant programming is to just reduce the gap between academic subjects and the lived experiences and the home lives of children of color in order to spark their interest in computer science or in these education subject areas and help them to remember and use the concepts in that subject area. Eventually, the goal is that these children of color will be able to identify with being successful in that subject area. So when Dr. Deerwater and I were building our project, we knew that in order for us to have culturally relevant modules and pedagogies in our program, we were going to need to make them tribe specific. So we've adapted the culturally relevant pedagogical model for Native tribes. So as I mentioned, there's like 574 plus federally recognized tribes in the US. But like I said, we're less than 2% of the population. So each of those tribes having their own populations, their own language, history, cultures, cosmologies, values, governance structures. We knew that in order to do this at scale, we were going to have to tailor our curricula to those contexts, to those tribes and those partner school communities. We needed to adapt our curricula to include those goals for sovereignty, to include their goals for the rematriation of land in order to make it significant to our children. So that's what in our project, that's what culturally relevant means. But it comes with a much broader background that we also, as Native women educators, had faced. And this is the ongoing colonizing system of education. I'm using that term colonizing deliberately to recognize that it's in the present. It never ended. Usually when people talk about colonization, there's this implication that it's past somehow, that we're past the colonization era. But for Native people, we've been experiencing this genocide as a continuing process over half a millennium. So we have half a millennium of data, if you want, that there's an ongoing project of colonization in education. And I'll tell you a second about that. I didn't want to talk too much about my own history, but I'm happy to tell you a little bit about my mom's. My mom grew up in her village, her tiny village of 750 people, and was one of 11 children that my grandmother and grandfather had. She spoke our native language as for her first language, Inupiaq. But she was sent to a boarding school hundreds of miles away from her village. And this was the colonizing system of education of her day. So she had to live in a residential school where she would be physically punished if she were caught speaking her own language. That could have meant a slap on the hand, or it could have meant worse. All kinds of other abuses were documented in these schools. She never spoke about it. That's how deep it went for her. She never talked about it, but she never taught us our language growing up either, even though she was a fluent firsthand speaker. So the residential and boarding school era, again, hasn't fully passed. There are still boarding schools in Indian country. They're usually run by the tribes themselves now to acknowledge that this is unacceptable treatment of children anywhere. But to say that colonizing is an ongoing process within education, we knew that we needed to disrupt that. And the first way that we learned to do that is through culturally relevant programming, was through trying to infuse the curricula with culture.
I think it's there's a lot in what you just said, and I think it's really important that people know that boarding schools. I didn't realize some were still open and in operation, but now by Native people. But even so, the ones that were where they were forced, people were forced into them, didn't stop until 70s, and then I think the last one stopped in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. So this is not history. and obviously that affects intergenerationally, as you've shown. So culturally relevant, and then also you're looking at it from an intersectional lens, really working to make sure that this is a program that girls will respond to, will receive value from. What does gender responsive mean on top of this?
This is my favorite part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Because this is some of the work that I believe the most strongly in. And I think when we talk about the intersectional barriers and the methods we need to lift those barriers, we had to start by intentionally building our team of Native women with STEM and CS experience at the higher education level by using both of our experiences, our personal lives, but also the deep literature on culture and gender responsive CS curricula that's developed over the past 20 years to come up with our first iteration of the CS courses that we designed. So much of these courses, much of the programs that we based our courses off of came from the out of school time space. So for example, the literature on engaging girls of color in CS has been led by Dr. Kimberly Scott, our partner at the Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology at ASU. And through her groundbreaking programming called CompuGirls, and now CompuPower, which is working at the systems level, she's created a theory called culturally responsive computing to talk about the ways in which empowering girls of color to solve challenges in their worlds through computing education and through discussing social justice and equity in CS classrooms is foundational to creating aspirations for girls of color in CS. We also used work that I'd been doing under the guidance and leadership of Dr. Allison Scott, our CEO at the Kapor Center, with their signature education program, SMASH, to inform our curriculum. Girls of Color in SMASH, which is a summer STEM immersion program, had been telling me for years in focus groups that they loved working with their hands on computing projects using robots or servo motors or e-textiles. They loved making tangible changes to the equipment through code and seeing how their projects worked in time and space. So we made our curricula as hands-on as we could in our pilot year, which is during this pandemic, using Spiro robots, Arduinos, all the servo motors, LED matrix lights. Of course, we continue to discuss what interests girls in CS in our program to refine our ideas. So in the winter sharing circles that we had, our girls told us that they would like to see more culturally relevant programming in their CS courses. We included 4 to 6 modules per course that had culturally relevant gender responsive activities, but it really wasn't enough when it was doled out over the course of the year. So Kathy and I decided to go back to the drawing board and reimagine the curricula entirely with tribe-specific cultural knowledges and gender responsive approaches as the organizing principles of the curricula. So for next year, we're incorporating a culture first perspective. All of these girls will learn about their culture at the top of every lesson and throughout the year. And the CS activities and projects will roll into that new framework. They'll be fitted in rather than the culture being fitted into the CS framework. We're super excited about the future of the program.
Yeah, that's awesome. It just seems like we should design all programs like this, right? And when we're, there, I looked for statistics and I haven't found statistics about how many Native people are in tech. It's there's just not a lot of data out there. So obviously very small. And there's a lot of barriers to entry. And we've talked about the big deep barriers around genocide and colonization, and also and on top of that, there's digital access, and maybe you could talk actually about a few more barriers there as well. But I think it's important to, when we're working to address this, redress this, that we are really looking at what are the issues and how do we then kind of take a step back like you did and design something that's really going to be unique and work.
Absolutely. So some of the barriers I mentioned in my own, I think, summary of my life as well. There's certainly, and you mentioned it just now, the digital divide is a huge barrier for Native participation in tech. I think this other piece, though, which we're trying to solve, is lack of access to these high quality and rigorous computer science courses that are tailored to them. That's something that we're really building out the edge of this concept of how deeply we can bring both the quality forward in the curricula and the culturally relevant pieces. So Native students overall, though, have some of the lowest college going rates of any racial or ethnic group in the US. 13%, I think, of Native people earn college degrees, and that's compared to over 20% for the US population as a whole. We also lack role models in tech because there are so few of us working in the sector. So there's very few folks that you can see in spaces like this. It's just I'm so glad you invited me to actually see folks who look like them or even come from their backgrounds in order to understand the challenges that they face. There's virtually no data about the number of Native people in the structure of tech or in the VC space. So it's not that there are no Native venture capitalists, but there's no reports anywhere about how many Native venture capitalists there are. We know anecdotally there are a few, but they're never captured in these reporting surveys. So we know that the barriers for Native people are steep in tech, but they're even steeper for Native girls who don't just have to face all of those racial and ethnic barriers that I just mentioned, but the gender ones as well. So sexual harassment, like I experienced, but also gendered stereotypes about who belongs in tech. So these are reinforced in all of these very subtle ways throughout most curricula. And that's why we're really trying to work as hard as we can to build out. Aside from the in-school curricula, we next year want to include an out-of-school time program just for girls to go alongside the academic year curricula and really infuse the same project-based approaches, gender-responsive approaches, but also leadership development, peer mentoring, near peer mentoring, access to role models, the college and career components that we want our girls to have as well. So we're really building out all these new directions for the new year based on what we've learned about these additional barriers that Native girls and students face.
Yeah, and the statistics show that in computers, the number of women earning computer science degrees has gone down significantly since the 80s. And I think a lot of what you were talking about also points to some of the reasons why women are sometimes it's not just that they aren't going into them in the first place, it's also that they're leaving them when they do get into those computer science programs because of the many reasons I think you've stated here. It's really important to acknowledge. We're going to jump to Q&A if you have questions in a little bit. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And in the meantime, I'll continue to ask you a couple more questions here. So, we talked about the barriers. Let's talk about the benefits. The benefits for expanding computer science programs, changing the way we teach, and also having more Native people in tech, right?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think, well, just to talk about the teaching for a moment, I think Gloria Ladson-Billings wrote an article years ago that I think the title of it was something like culturally relevant pedagogies. Well, that's just good teaching.
Right, exactly.
It's really to demystify the concept, I think, a little bit, but also to acknowledge that all students need that spark, need to see how it's relevant to their lives in order to learn a subject area, especially when that content knowledge wasn't built for them in mind. So I think on the teaching level, culturally responsive and relevant pedagogies really get to the core of what good teaching is. Reaching the students, reaching their passions and interests, cultivating that, developing that, and maintaining it, like you're saying, and supporting it. I think the other side in terms of natives in tech and why it's good to have natives in tech, I think I personally, I feel like what we're doing is actually to support the tribes in their goals, in their sovereignty goals. It's for me less about how tech benefits in a way, but also more how tech can be a tool for communities, Native communities, to get their land back. And in a couple of different ways. We're working in these small rural areas, one in eastern Oklahoma, in Stillwell, Oklahoma, with the Cherokee Nation, one of their high schools. And we're also working in rural New Mexico, the Mescalero Apache Reservation. And so these two areas are not economically vibrant areas. They're some of the lowest income areas of their regions. And what these skills have the potential to do for the families and students of these school systems is to really give them the way that these children can stay at home with their families. They can work and live and earn a good living in their tribal and traditional territories, which is a huge benefit for Native people. Again, 78% of us no longer live on our territories. Computer science is one of the ways we can keep our kids home. Another big benefit is the goals of rematriation, the goals of getting our land back. We really do need technologies these days in order to make that work happen. The website links that I give you, potentially were made and coded by non-native people, right? And what is the vision of these programs online if we don't have native creators working on the aesthetics, working on the ways that they work, working on the functionality of these programs? Folks with these different, diverse, and rich cosmologies, I think would bring a lot to the development of these tools and apps as well. That we've seen in our program, there's a lot of creativity. The students love making things move. They love creating the drama of, having like a dance party, little cardboard cutouts, rocking to some music. They really get into the creative aspects as well. It resonates with them that they can change their worlds and environments. So it empowers them on a very deep level to impress their peers, to impress their parents, their siblings. Sometimes they tell us, my brother's the smarty in the family, getting all the A's, and I, can do this complicated wizardry with an Arduino, and all of a sudden everybody's in awe, of my skills. So there's a lot that it gives our families and communities aside from the economic resources to continue and persist on in their tribal territories. But definitely there's a spark of creativity and imagination as well.
Awesome. And can you say a little bit, if you have some thoughts about how, a lot of people who are listening to this are working in their workplaces on diversity and inclusion. They're working on creating change in their workplaces. Are there some principles that you see that people could take away? I mean, there's a lot here that people could take away into their workplaces, and what would you recommend?
I would definitely start with considering to institutionalize a land acknowledgement as the tip of the iceberg way. I think the land acknowledgement with the accountable relationships, so with being able to provide the tribes whose territories you're working or living on with some means to survive is a huge part of what these accountable relationships, what the transformation could look like in this sector. And it says a lot in terms of welcoming Native people into an organization or into a company when there is that practice already established. Anyone can do a land acknowledgement. You don't have to be Native. You don't have to speak a Native language in order to do a land acknowledgement. You merely have to honor and pay respect to the people whose lands you're on, to name them, and to build that accountable relationship with them, to support them in some way. That relationship will hopefully change, again, ideally, some of the ways in which the business practices are go on and how the business runs over time. I mean, that's ultimately one of the goals of sovereignty and rematriation, that the people who are here align some of their work and what they're doing with what we need in order to survive, with what our tribes need in order to persist. So there's there's some really big directions there. But I think other than that, creating these conversations will help in a much more tangible way folks to understand where they are in the landscape of Indian country, understand what the needs are in terms of career and college pathway development. And those partnerships with ACES, with other Native serving organizations, again, can really help transform these communities who currently have so little access to the sector.
Great. I want to talk a little bit about, we haven't really talked about COVID and the impact of COVID on Native communities. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about any thoughts that you have about in this moment. So back almost a year ago, we talked with Vanessa Roanhorse. And if anybody wants to listen to that episode, we talked specifically about Indigenous allyship for Indigenous people. That episode was episode 3, supporting Indigenous power, leadership, and community. And we talked a lot about COVID and the impact on her. She's Dene, so on the people in the Navajo Nation. Could you say a little bit about what allyship means to you for Indigenous people right now, especially given the moment we're in?
Absolutely. And thank you for that. I'm so glad you had a chance to talk with Vanessa's amazing. And
Yeah.
I always learn a lot when I talk with Vanessa. So
Me too.
I'll have to check back and see what that episode was like. But I definitely feel like allyship in the times of COVID is so important. We have seen threats to an entire tribe, threats to entire families during COVID, culture bearers, language bearers, elders have passed away in huge numbers already, and we're not through it yet. And so our systems and our economies just across the country are strained and at capacity in a lot of ways. To begin with, in Indian country, those systems, some of them are completely broken down. There's tons of folks without jobs or incomes. A lot of the sectors that employ women of color, especially, have been impacted so heavily by COVID. So the hospitality, dining, beauty, retail, tons of these sectors where women of color have been able to support their families as sole breadwinners have been impacted. And that includes Native women and Indigenous women more broadly. So it's definitely the economic support for Indian country and for Native communities, Native serving organizations in these bigger cities where there's high populations of intertribal Native communities is huge. So I would definitely include the intertribal communities in our urban areas as a big source of support for Native people broadly. And one of the areas of highest and greatest need that probably isn't talked about as much. Because again, we have these programs, these GoFundMes for some of the larger tribes, like the Navajo Nation's a massive tribe, the Cherokee Nation, huge tribes. There are tribes that are tiny, that are also disconnected, that are in rural areas that don't get as much support. There's also unrecognized tribes, as I mentioned earlier. The Ohlone are not a federally or state recognized tribe, and there isn't really one Ohlone tribe to speak of. And so it becomes very complicated to learn how to support unrecognized tribes. And that's where intertribal and community-based organizations in urban areas are key. They provide the food programs that people have needed for their families, the rental assistance programs and mutual aid programs. And again, there's CARES Act funding that's come to some of these organizations, but oftentimes not enough. And for some, too late to save many people. So definitely we have very little infrastructure, institutional infrastructure in Indian country, but the little that's there is it's spread out in these little pockets, and it takes some work to find them. So here in the Bay Area, we have something called the Intertribal Friendship House. This is a kind of a pillar organization for the Bay Area's intertribal community here. They've established good relationships with the Ohlone folks here as well. And again, they haven't been able to put on their usual programming. They haven't been able to host in-person events where they were able to collect some donations. They're one of the anchor institutions that in Indian country here locally that can use a lot of support, but there's many others. And it's worth looking to see where donations could be made, where your business operating cities are, and local areas to those cities with Native populations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we'll put some of those resources on our website too, along with this episode. So again, changecatalyst.co/allyship series. So look for those. We'll also we'll also send a follow-up email with a link to that as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Frieda, how can people get involved with your work? Where can they learn more? How can they get involved? People and companies, right? I think you have partnerships as well.
We do. First of all, this is fantastic. This by itself is a conversation. Folks beginning to learn about the systems and structures and how they impact Native people in tech and CS is huge. So I just want to thank everyone for hanging on with us through the hour to learn about this and to inform yourself. So that's a huge thing already. I think in terms of connecting directly with my project, we are always looking for partnerships in terms of finding role models and near peer mentors for our girls. So if there are Indigenous or Native women working for your company and you'd like to get in touch and see if there's a possibility to connect with us, I'm dropping, and of course this can be shared as well in the podcast information. I'm dropping my email address there in the chat so that you can get in touch directly with me. We are working with folks who are Indigenous to many areas of Turtle Island. And I would say I would extend that to the Americas more broadly. And so if you know of Indigenous identified folks and women, we'd love to meet with them, connect with them, and work with them on this project. So that's one definite way. We're also hoping to build pathways locally to our communities, to job opportunities, internships, work experience, apprenticeships, et cetera. So please do reach out if you have a program that's meant to serve underrepresented people and girls or women in particular. We would love to connect and talk about ways that we can collaborate on helping recruit for those programs or advertise them to our students. And then another way that you can support is we are wanting to, we are also eager to build partnerships with other Native ERGs, Native organizations that you're connected to. So if you have any connections out there, either folks that you've already supported in your work or community-based organizations that you're looking to support, and you think that they might be a good fit to work with us, we'd love to hear about it. So absolutely, there's definitely ways to connect, but the main thing is to keep learning and growing. All Native people are reconnecting is what I like to say, because colonization is an ongoing process. So we're learning alongside of all of you about our own histories, our own cultures, our own languages. But yeah, certainly that effort is so appreciated. And I really appreciate you again, Melinda, for offering the time and space for me on the show today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom and all your work. And I think that it is, hopefully people will take from this and get involved in your work, and also rethink some of our programs and the way that we do this work, the work of allyship, the work of advocacy. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for tuning in and for doing this work of change. And my question to you is, how will you rethink your work to be more intersectional in your allyship and advocacy? So join us each week, and please share this with your colleagues. You can find the previous podcast episodes at changecatalyst.co/allyship series. And please please spend a moment to find our episode on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube and like it and subscribe to it. That definitely helps us grow our audience as well. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Frieda, so much.
Appreciate you. Kiana Buck, everyone. Thank you very much.
See you all next week.